What does it really mean to be human, especially in a world that feels more disconnected by the day? Today, we're looking at the science of emotion, happiness, and why students may be struggling more than ever, even as they push for a better future. Welcome back to the What and Who of EDU, where we bring you insights from the leading educators, researchers, and innovators who are shaping the future of teaching and learning. On our podcast, we share real-world classroom strategies that help you create a more impactful and effective learning environment. I'm your host, Marissa Bluestone, and today we have a really special episode. We're joined by two incredible minds in the field who just happen to be authors of the #1 psychology textbook. Dr. David Myers is a professor of psychology at Hope College and a trusted voice in psychological science. His work has shaped how millions of students think about the brain, behavior, and beyond. Dr. Gruber is a leading researcher in emotion science and mental health, whose work asks bold, important questions about happiness, well-being, and what it means to thrive. In this episode, we dive into what's changed in psychology over the decades, what today's data really say about student well-being, and why the happiest people may not always be the ones chasing the happiness. Before we dig in, I did want to note that this episode includes sensitive topics, including discussion of student mental health challenges. If that's not the right fit for you today, we completely understand, and we'll see you in a future episode. Dave and June, I am so excited to have you both here. I know your work has shaped how millions of students think about psychology, but I'd love to hear how you first got pulled into this field and more about your entry point into the world of psychology.
So, my coming to psychology and to authoring this textbook illustrates what's true of many students as well. I was a pre-med chemistry biology major who worked 3 summers in Seattle County Hospital, took the medical college admissions test, and at the end of my junior year decided I didn't want to become a doctor. I wanted to become a professor, but I needed something to profess that wasn't chemistry. And so I thought back to the one psych class I'd had in my first year, and I thought how interesting that was. Almost on a lark, I decided I'd become a psychology professor. That led to an opportunity to become a professor at Hope College. And I got interested in a particular research puzzle unexpectedly when I thought my focus was going to be just on teaching. That led to an invitation to attend a research conference where I happened to be assigned a seat next to somebody who was later asked about writing a textbook, and he gave the publisher my name, and that led ultimately to the conversation that we're having right now. And I tell you this story simply because what it illustrates is true of almost every one of our listeners, and that is how hard it is to predict your future. If you're a high school senior or a college first or second year student, I have a confident prediction about your life, and that is that 10 years from now, you're going to be doing something you don't currently imagine. And that's the reason why what you need is a broad liberal education that's going to expand your mind, help you think clearly, evaluate evidence, communicate effectively, know who you are. Anyway, a long answer, but that's my story, and it's in some sense everybody's story.
Yeah, I still say I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. So it's true wherever you are in your
Right.
career. How about you, June? What's your origin story and what drew you to psychology?
I remember as a teenager always being interested in reading stories about people's experiences. This was through literature at the time and being so curious why people feel what they do, why they act the way they do, essentially what makes us human beings. And at the time, I was so captivated by human stories and human experience, but didn't really know what there was to do to have the tools to understand that further. And then I remember my first class of college, I walked into this giant lecture hall. There must have been 700 students, and it was an introduction to psychology course. And I remember being fascinated, being excited that here was something I could study that would actually give me tools and actually help me ask questions about kind of why people are the way they are. And so I was really excited because psychology let you understand other people. And I felt it was really diverse. Like you could, go to the level of the neuron, or you could watch large groups of people and wonder why certain groups are different than other groups. I felt like you didn't have to give anything up. You got to learn all these tools and also, I think, answer what is probably some of the most interesting questions as all of us are human beings, which is why we act the way we do.
Dave, since you pretty much had a front row seat to the evolution of psychology through your writing and your teaching, I'm curious to learn what you think has changed the most in the field since you started.
So those first editions happened in the mid 1980s. So we're really asking over the last 40 years, how has psychological science grown? I would say three things come to mind. One is the emergence of behavior genetics, especially during the first half of that period, understanding how nature and nurture weave together the human fabric. Then the second thing would be the emergence of neuroscience. We've learned so much since then about how the brain makes mind and emotions. And that is a continuing field of where we see a lot of exciting new developments as we come to understand the brain mind connection better. A third thing that happened is the emergence of the positive psychology movement. So it was in the year 2000 that Martin Seligman, as the president of the American Psychological Association, proposed a new, more positive psychology that has flourished over the last quarter century. And June and I have both been part of that.
June, you've been right in the mix of that shift towards positive psychology. What are you seeing in the latest research about students' well-being, and how does that shape the way that you either teach or write about it?
I think right now, when we look at the well being of today's students, many of whom are young adults, they're really giving us a pulse on where society's at. And to be really honest, they are shedding insight into what makes humans thrive and what can pose challenges. Many of today's students have endured a set of unique challenges in their life. They've gone through the pandemic, they've seen a lot of changes globally, and they're facing a very unique and bright and in some ways also uncertain future. So I look to them to say, how are we doing as a society and where are the points of thriving and challenge? On the one hand, we're seeing that today's students are both in a unique place where they are advocating for themselves. They're wanting to be part of the conversation about mental health. They're wanting to be active in conversations about what's happening in the world. So there's a lot of wonderful points of growth and a lot of wonderful spaces for them to shape the future of our world. We're seeing a challenged sense of social belonging, wanting to be back in their social community, wanting to connect with their peers, and finding some challenges at times with that. So I think what the research is saying about today's students is that there's a lot of challenges to mental health that they're facing, but at the same time, they're coming in strong with ideas. They're speaking up and really, I think, bringing suggestions both to the research we do in psychology and also the best way to take psychology and actually make it relevant to their lives. And they're asking us for that, which is, I think, exactly what we want to be doing as educators and writers and researchers. So I think they're a very inspiring group of students and very different and active and have a powerful voice, like I think really no other cohort of students before them.
So I think if I could just jump in, what June is saying as a mental health expert is so important. And it coincides with the emergence of smartphones and social media and the decline of face to face social relationships. So it really is kind of unprecedented in my life experience. It's going to be interesting, June, don't you think, to see whether things turn around in some sense, whether we manage to reconnect and recover what were levels of well being that we saw in students in the past.
Dave, I completely agree with you. And I think this is pushing us as a field in psychology and in our kind of one on one and group interactions we have with students to find new ways to better support them because they are in a different space. Are there ways we can even leverage social media to connect them with peers rather than distance them? Are there new ways to kind of tackle mental health that are going to require us to think outside of the box of what we've done before, because students are needing new tools, right? That get them connecting with others, that get them outside, moving their bodies, that pay attention to how they're sleeping, all these essential parts of being human that I don't think were paid attention to as much in the past. And we know how important they are now.
And part of our challenge is educating students about exactly what you're talking about so that they can make intentional choices that will help them flourish in their relationships and in their emotions. Am I naive to hope that with education about the toxicity of not normal, but excessive social media hours online, comparing oneself to others' beautiful photos and so forth, people might make different choices intentionally and sleep more, read more, connect more?
Dave, I think you're exactly right. And I think now students are realizing the importance of being empowered in choosing how to limit time spent on social media, how to make sure that they are connecting face to face with their friends and not solely relying on Instagram or texting or viewing photos vicariously. I think they're realizing that they also need to shift their relationship with social media because it's no longer serving them good at the amount and the kind of frequency and the way in which they're engaging in it.
Amen, sister.
June, your work really dives into the nuance of positive emotion, not just how we feel better, but what it means to feel too good. Is there such a thing as too much happiness? And how do we help students to make sense of that?
I really appreciate you asking that question. And it's one that I have a lot of very interesting conversations with my students in class about, which is there ever too much of a good thing? Can positivity become toxic? And what does happiness look like in the current era we're in? I do think the way we approach positivity in some ways can push us towards this excess positivity where there's the notion that happiness means being excited and joyful at every minute, that it means we are constantly prioritizing ourselves and engaging in 24/7 self care. And I think what we're finding and what we need to keep in mind is that to really think about the benefits of positive emotion, it requires going beyond just feeling positive. And by that, some of the work that we've done, both in my lab, but also in some of the resources, these assess your strength activities that we've been doing for Achieve, have involved teaching students about something called emotional diversity. I just love this work. It really leverages on what we already know about biodiversity, how important it is for planet Earth that we all live on, right, to sustain the physical health of our ecosystem. But students and all of us don't often think about our own kind of mental or emotional ecosystem, and that it's important we have a variety of emotions, not just happiness, but times it can be other positive states, calm, compassion. But in fact, we have other emotions that are there for a reason too, whether it's sadness or sometimes anxiety or even sometimes frustration and anger, and that all these emotions have a purpose in our lives. They all have a function, and we don't need to feel ashamed if we're feeling upset or embarrassed. We don't need to suppress or push it away. But in fact, we can welcome and accept a diversity of emotions. And in fact, it relates to decreased depression risk, greater physical health. Some of my colleagues have even linked greater diversity of emotions that people have in their life with kind of reduced markers of inflammation. And I think the other part is that when we think about too much of a good thing, sometimes that can also be equated with the sort of I happy generation, that being happy is about focusing on me. And it's a very kind of, in some ways, self-focused and lonely journey. I need to buy books. I need to buy things that are going to bring me pleasure and bring me happiness. And what we actually find is that positivity is more about turning our attention towards others, fostering those friendships and relationships, doing kind things for other people, and even reflecting on what we're grateful for from other people. So just making sure that we don't think about happiness being about being upbeat with a kind of sunny side up attitude all the time, and that it's not always about us. We need to really remember we are social creatures and we need to take care of those relationships with other people.
That's a really good point, June, because there's kind of an irony, isn't there, that the more somebody focuses internally on their own happiness and ruminates about that, which depressed people tend to do, the less happy they often are compared to people who focus beyond themselves on purposes and activities that are greater than self.
How does the data back this up?
About what people think is going to make them happy. Well, I'll tell you, one thing that people think is going to make them happy is to have a lot of money. So more than 8 in 10 students say that it is very important or essential that they be very well off financially. And when Gallup surveyed Americans, 79%, 8 in 10, said it is very important or extremely important that they have money. And we have a lot of evidence relevant to that. And they're right to a point. If you compare people in rich and poor countries or rich and poor people within a country, you find that as income or wealth increases, self-reported happiness and life satisfaction increases up to a point, but then you get diminishing returns. Once people can afford life's necessities, they have a sense of control over their life and a sense of security. There's a satiation effect, it's called. It has diminishing returns. And it's also the case that as our disposable income, that's inflation adjusted per person income, has nearly tripled over the last half century, and with it all the stuff we can buy, our happiness as a nation and as a people has not increased at all. And so people think money and more money and more money is going to make them happier and happier and happier. It only does to a point. And then other things, relationships, meaning, purpose, faith, whatever, seem really to matter more.
I remember seeing that $75,000 mark as a point. Dave, is that what it is, or is it relative to?
Yeah, and that was a few years ago, so we need to inflation adjust that. By the way, economists have said, no, it's a straight line increase. As income increase, happiness increases. But little catch here, they're talking about log income. If you talk about real dollars that we live with, then there's a curvilinear relationship. Happiness increases with money, but that increase tapers off once you get above that satiation point, which is now, $80,000 or $90,000, depending on where you live, of course.
Yeah, that $80,000 looks pretty different in rural Iowa than it does in downtown Seattle, I bet. But June, is there a study that you think more educators should know, like something that stuck with you because it has the real potential to change how we support students?
There is some fascinating recent research that I do think would be a game changer. And it's something that I try to bring into my classroom in the past couple of years because I think it can really relate to students' everyday experiences. And that's the research on the science of awe, and that's AWE. I always say it's not AWW. And this is the experience of wonder, amazement, seeing the world as something bigger than yourself. This is some really exciting research from Dacher Keltner, who's at UC Berkeley and in the Greater Good Science Center. And I love this work because it suggests there's this other piece of being a human being that we haven't really considered enough, that we haven't talked enough about, but can really change our well-being in ways that can be free, that we can all do relatively easily in our lives, and that can really shift our perspective on things. So the idea behind awe is that there's this natural human emotion we have of wonder, of reverence, of a sense of feeling in the presence of something bigger than ourselves. So imagine that it could be out in nature and you're seeing this vast landscape of mountains. We have those here in Colorado, or the ocean, or at night below a sky and seeing all the constellations. It could also be, you go to a concert or you go see some beautiful art. You see a speech by someone who is someone that you just think is an incredible human being. There's these opportunities we all have to feel in the presence of something wonderful, something amazing. And in fact, there's these pretty simple, 10-minute walks you can take in your own. It can be in a neighborhood. It can be like in nature. It can be pretty much anywhere you want that guide people how to cultivate this sense of wonder in our lives. And it's not just doing it as a sort of recreational activity. It's actually something that can profoundly shape people's mental health. So you find people that go on these brief 10, 15-minute awe walks, and there's these, again, freely available scripts you can find online. We've integrated these into some of the student activities we do in our textbook. But when people go out and do this and students do this, there's this amazing data showing they feel less stressed, less depressed. And in fact, people also feel like a smaller sense of self, that there's a bigger world than me. And I think that brings actually a lot of comfort and relief to students. But it's this wonderful new science on something that can be, in addition to other mental health strategies we're taking to help students feel better and less stressed.
June, I have to say, just listening to you makes me feel uplifted and excited because I've been thinking a lot about exactly what you're talking about. Our purpose in teaching introductory psychology is, to me, it has three big things we're doing. One is to teach some really big, life relevant ideas about human nature and human understanding. But two other goals that we have are helping people think smarter, think in terms of evidence, think critically about life. But the third one is what fascinates me now, and it's exactly what you're talking about, and that is helping people to appreciate the wonders of our humanity. I was in a book group discussion recently with some fellow colleagues, and Barry Schwartz, retired from Swarthmore, was saying that he tries to help students understand that the real wonders of life that can help us experience awe are in the ordinary things of life. And part of our communicating psychological science is an attempt to help people experience the wonders of our own human existence. And so I'm actually in the midst of writing or drafting a little, I don't know if it'll become a book. I'm entitled it, We Are Wonderfully Made. And it's building off the Psalm, we are fearfully, that is awesomely and wonderfully made. Cataloging and explaining and exploring and celebrating the wonders of vision and hearing and human development from womb to tomb and everything. And I find myself just uplifted as I work with all these incredible wonders that are part of our human nature.
So, Dave, what's a study that you referenced in your writing that students always respond to with, wait, what? Is that real?
Yeah, well, I think the most shocking finding for me, and I think many people in all of psychological science, is the limits of parental nurture in shaping lives. Parents aren't the potter that shape through their handling of children, the clay that are their children. Now, parents do matter, and we can see that when we compare the abused child with a loved child, or when we compare the values and politics of children and those of their parents. But when it comes to people's traits, say their temperament or their outgoingness versus introversion, or their intellectual abilities, behavior genetics studies tell us that the shared environment effect that would include parental nurture is like on the order of 10% or so of the variation among individuals. We know this, by the way, by comparing identical and fraternal twins, by comparing adopted children's traits to those of their biological and adopted parents. And we know it from the famed studies of identical twins who were separated at birth and reared separately. Genes matter, and peer influences matter greatly. But there's no single smart gene or extroversion gene or depression gene, but genes matter big time, as many genes, each having small effects, make a big difference. And the bottom line is kind of shocking. I mean, Robert Plomin, the great behavior geneticist, has said starkly, we would essentially be the same person if we had been adopted at birth and raised in a different family. Well, if that doesn't shock you, I don't know what. Dan Briscar, the great developmental psychologist, said, this implies that parents should be given less credit for kids who turn out great and blamed less for kids who don't. And so the bottom line here, it seems to me, is that kind of a comforting lesson, really, that knowing that children's personalities and talents are not sculpted like a potter shaping clay, perhaps could help parents relax and love and encourage their children for who they are.
It's definitely interesting. I'm going to have to tell that to my mom later today. See what she says about that. June, what studies do you share that surprise students?
I think in a culture where, there's an obsession with youth There's songs like Forever Young. There's a fear of growing old. I think students respond with, wait, is that for real? When I share some of this work on the psychology of happiness and aging, I love this work by Laura Carstensen at Stanford that finds that we actually grow happier as we grow older. And in fact, if you compare your average young adult to your average older adult, the older adults are happier. And I think sometimes that flies in the face of stereotypes we have about aging, but teaches us a lesson that there's a wisdom that comes with age, and there may be certain kinds of perspectives that we may want to take as young adults, I say to my students, and grab them now and not wait until our 80th birthday to really maximize, which is really focusing a little bit more on being present. I know students can be so caught up, understandably, in thinking about the future, planning for it, stressing about it, but taking a moment to focus on the time here and now, remembering that their social relationships are about quality, not quantity, and that they will come with time to become more and more aware of who they are and more aware of how to manage their own feelings and to sort of trust in their own self-knowledge that's going to grow with time. But I love the idea that, like, when we look at the horizon, there's a happy and happier one down the road.
Yeah, that sounds like something that's pretty misunderstood. But I'm curious, is there anything else from psychological research that the general public consistently misunderstands, and should that matter?
That makes me think about research that I think the general public commonly misunderstands, which is this idea that we are inherently selfish creatures, that, at the end of the day, it's all about us. And even when we're doing things that on the surface seem kind, it's really self-serving. And I think when you talk about the wonders of human beings, one of them that I always really try to emphasize the most is that at our core, we are kind creatures. We are altruistic. We do, even without thinking twice, instinctively help other people. That human beings are at their core good. I think in a time right now where people are feeling divided and people are feeling disconnected and feeling that it's hard to understand the perspective of the other side, whatever that other side is or other group is, to go back to our roots as human beings and that we are social species. We do care about others. We instinctively want to help rather than self-serve. And that time and time again, you look at data from, I'm thinking of David Rand, who does these time decision-making tasks and finds when we're sort of forced to make a decision quickly and without thinking, we intuitively tend to cooperate more. We intuitively tend to give more to others than take for ourselves. I was recently hearing about some research on the bystander effect by Dr. Abigail Marsh at Georgetown, and a recent paper showing that they reviewed these different kind of security recording tapes of people who had been hurt by someone in public, and 90% of the time, the bystanders helped. That overturns this notion that we only have ourselves at stake, but in fact, we care a lot about other people, even without trying. So to remember that human beings are good at their core, and rather than thinking we need to change people from selfish to selfless, that maybe we just need to really return to the roots of what human beings were in the first place, which we are a kind species.
I love that. Dave, what about you? What do you think the general public misunderstands? And should it be something that we try to change?
One thing I wish we could change in the public understanding is the importance of basing conclusions on evidence rather than anecdotes and story. So, a couple examples. Each year, 7 in 10 Americans tell Gallup that there's more crime in the United States than there was the year before. The next year, they say the same thing, even though the crime rates have plummeted since 1990. Or there's an anecdote about a child who gets a vaccine and then is diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And based on some stories, people connect the two. And what we want to do in this text, in addition to helping people understand some big ideas about human nature is help people think smarter. And that means wanting to see the evidence and basing conclusions that are socially, individually, politically relevant on the basis of evidence. And part of our job is to do effective storytelling that illustrates and is consistent with real evidence. But if there's one thing I could change, it would be to help students, as they become educated people, to think about the world in terms of pertinent evidence and to give less attention to possibly atypical anecdotes, stories, and experiences.
Yeah, personal anecdotes do seem to be playing quite a bit of a role in storytelling. But let's zoom out a little bit. Dave, is there a big question in psychology that we don't really have the answer to yet, but that you wish we did?
One really big question, which is called the hard question of consciousness, is how the brain makes mind, awareness. I was for 6 years a trustee of the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and we devoted and made grants to multiple millions of dollars in funding to different research teams who were engaging in adversarial collaboration. That is, where they're testing competing theories about how the brain makes mind and agreeing on certain testing procedures. And so that's a super big question I don't think we're ever going to completely answer, but people are actually working at that.
I think that's a big one. And June, what do you think? Is there a question you don't have an answer to, but you wish we did?
Yes, as both an educator and also a clinical psychologist, I think one question we don't have an answer to is how exactly can the human brain help us both diagnose mental health disorders, but also develop more precise or specific treatments for each individual person? The dream would be one day that we could simply use neuroimaging or the latest tool at that time to look inside someone's brain and be able to say, here's a specific treatment plan. Now, we're not there yet, but I certainly know there are a lot of psychiatrists, neuroscientists, and clinical psychologists that are working really hard to address this gap so that we can truly understand behavior and the brain to tackle one of our biggest public health crises, which is truly, the societal weight of severe and costly and recurrent mental health disorders right now, especially among our young adults.
All right, we'll end this one episode with a question to you, Dave, and that is, you often talk about the value of developing resilience. Why is this so important? And is there a research area that you followed that gives you real hope about where society is headed?
Well, I'm hopeful because we are resilient. I mean, all of us have a mix of ups and downs in our lives. Good things happen, but then also relationships fail, a job is lost, an illness strikes. And the good news is, with some exceptions, I mean, the death of a child or, I'll leave a pit in one's stomach forever. But with the normal range of human experiences, we are more resilient than we realize. The half-life of negative emotions is shorter than most people expect. People who don't get tenure and lose their faculty jobs have been found to be understandably distraught. But if you go back to them 5 or 10 years later, they're almost all thriving and flourishing in their lives in new ways they haven't anticipated. On the other hand, something extremely good happens. You win the lottery and get $1 million or whatever. You're elated, but only for a time, because we tend to adapt whatever is our recent experience. And so we recalibrate our experience and we are resilient. And for some people, trauma can even be followed by growth. This is true for, by the way, for people with disabilities. You don't see it if you're listening to this, but without my hearing technology, I am completely deaf. I have a cochlear implant and a very powerful hearing aid, and I cannot hear the sound of my own voice without them. And even with them, life is sometimes a challenge and will be more so. But we are resilient and we can cope with change and loss. And that's just my own version of it.
I just want to say, Dave, I completely resonate with you how powerful and how, in some ways, surprising it is how incredibly resilient human beings are through, as you said, some of the most even unthinkable losses we can imagine. And I think understanding resilience better and teaching it to our students will give everyone tools to be better equipped to thrive in the modern world.
A special thanks to Dave and June for such a thoughtful conversation. Next time, we bring the psychology out of the lab and into the classroom. And good news, there's no PhD required. We'll be talking more about some practical ways to teach like a psychologist, including giving some strategies on how to better support student wellness and belonging. If you're an educator, a student, or just someone navigating the ups and downs of being human, we hope today's episode gave you something to think about and something to feel. We'll see you next time on the What and Who of EDU. Until then, I will be on an all walk.